The application that we're going to be reviewing is honestly one of the best examples of a modern React application that has all of the best practices and design patterns implemented. Honestly, if you want to see how a professional React project looks like at scale, this is it. It doesn't really get any better than this. And if you want to learn how to build a project like this and literally be guided every step of the way, check out Project React, which is going to be the first link in the description. So this is what we're going to be looking at today. It is the new Node.js website that got released recently, and honestly, it's just incredible. The code is so modern, clean, efficient, and this is coming from a project that has literally hundreds of contributors. If you ever wanted to find a project that you could use as a model for your own applications, then this is it. So watch this video, watch it carefully, because we're going to dive into some really cool stuff. So this is what the code for this project looks like. It is built using next.js, and it's using the new app router. You can see here the app folder and all of the new modern features of next.js. In fact, I believe that currently this is on the latest version of next.js or close to it, which is honestly great considering that this project has been years in development and that they've successfully managed to keep it up to date consistently. So here we have the folder structure of this project, and there's quite a lot of files here. And this folder structure is a great example of a folder structure in a bigger project, which has a couple of folders that you wouldn't typically see in smaller projects. Let's look at some of the folders that are available in this project. So of course we have the app folder, which is used for the Next.js app router. That's where all of the magic happens. Then we have the components folder, which is a folder for all components, which here there's a lot of interesting components that we're going to look at in this video. So stay tuned. Then we also have the hooks folder, which is the traditional folder for all of the custom hooks. Then we also have pages over here. Now this is very interesting because this project is using the Next.js app router, but it also has pages. So we're going to look at how they're doing that and specifically why they're doing that. Then we have providers, which is for a couple of provider components used in the application. Then we have public for everything that is public, like the manifest.json and other different files. Then we have styles for all the styles, the base styles in the project, types for all the types, and finally the utils folder, which I will die on the hill saying that this is the most underrated folder in any React project. Cool, so there's a lot of folders here with a lot of different files, which is going to make for a great video. And once again, this is a great example of a folder structure in a bigger project. Everything is organized, clearly labeled, and there are obvious patterns, right? You need to make a new component, go in the components folder. You need a new hook, go and put it in the hooks folder. You want some new types, go and add them in the types folder over here, right? You need to have a utility, put it in the utils folder. Everything is clearly labeled, which makes it super easy to work with it when you have a bunch of developers all wanting to contribute at the same time. So let's first come here and look at the app directory, because what they've done here is really interesting and is something that is not so common with a lot of React applications. So here I'm going to go inside of app and then locale, and then inside of this path directory over here and open up this page. If you're not familiar with how the app router works in Next.js, this is file-based routing, and the way that this folder is structured is actually how the URL is going to map to a specific file. So in this case, because we're putting this in brackets, we're saying that this is a URL parameter that can be dynamic. So for example, the locale, it can be English, French, Spanish, and so on. And then here, we're just doing the spread operation here, which acts as a catch-all for any dynamic URL parameter, any dynamic path that a user can go on. And the reason they did this is because they actually have one file and one component that is rendering every single dynamic file that is available in this project, any single dynamic path. And all of those paths are coming directly from pages over here. So we have pages/en. And by the way, the only reason why they have only /en is because currently only English is supported. So if you want to actually contribute to this project, one easy contribution is just to go and add your own custom language. What they did here, as far as I can understand, is all of these files here in the pages directory all are markdown files, right? You have here branding.mdx, md markdown, right? You have index.mdx. All of these is actually the content of this website, because this is a static website. If you go here, it's all static, right? It's just a bunch of pages with some information. All of this is rendered using markdown. And then based off of that, we're going back here to app and then this path over here. And then all of the logic is happening in this specific file, which basically renders the actual content based on the path. So once again, this is a little bit unusual. You don't typically see this in an application, but let's look a little bit at this to understand how this is actually working. So let's close this and let's look at this file. Now, first of all, what I want to say is that you're not supposed to completely understand every single line of code directly in this video. There's a lot going on here. And actually, if you want to really understand this, you have to go and pull the code in your machine and actually go and look at the definition of all of these things and make a mental picture as to how everything fits together. which honestly, that is something that I really recommend that you do because there's a lot to learn here. But essentially what we're doing here is because we have one file that is rendering any dynamic path, we have to do some things to actually get some data for that path. For example, the metadata, right? We want to have unique metadata for each specific page, but since we only have this one component, we have to generate the metadata dynamically using the parameters. And this is something that you can do in next.js. And as you can see here, it is even labeled and commented where you can get more information as to how to do that. Generate metadata is a function that you can put in next.js to do exactly that. We're doing the same thing for the viewport. We're doing custom things for the routes to locale, basically taking the locale and then just getting all of the routes that we can have in the application, generating some static params, and then we have this get page function over here, which is actually responsible for rendering the content that you see on every single page. So here, if you look at this application, we have about, we have all of this, we have that one component that is rendering the actual content that you see inside of this page here, inside of most pages in the application. So again, don't worry if you don't initially understand every single line of code here. Even I don't understand this fully because I haven't taken the time to actually dig deep and look at every single function and file that is being used. But essentially, we're using the locale, we're using the path, and then based off of that, we're just determining here if we have to run this piece of code, which is going to render this JSX component here, or not. We're just getting the actual source and the file name. I believe here this is when this is not a path that is defined inside of this pages directory here, but we still want to render it. And in that case, we're going to do this piece of code here. Otherwise, we actually have a file name. We have the actual contents of the file. We can just get the MDX content, which is the markdown content. And then what they're doing is they're just rendering the actual markdown over here using the MDX render component and passing it the component over here. Again, feel free to go and look at this in more detail if you really want to understand it, but essentially what's important here is the decision that they've made to have one file, one component that is responsible for rendering every single page or most of the pages that are available in the application. This is as opposed to having different files and each file rendering one single page in the application, which is a more traditional approach in React applications. And I'm not really sure why they did that, but I do trust that they have a reason to do that. And from what I understand, I think it's pretty difficult to put the markdown content in the new app router, and that they had to do it in the pages router and make this entire combination of using the markdown content in the pages router and then putting everything through the app router. Again, I'm not 100% sure as to why they did it, but I do trust that they have a valid reason for doing it the way that they did. But the fact that they did it this way is actually really cool because this shows us that there's actually not one single way to build a React project. It ultimately depends on the actual project and what the project needs. Because in this case, the application is mostly static content that is defined inside of a folder using Markdown, and this is more a website than it is an application, you actually don't need and you can get away with having one file that renders all of the content dynamically using parameters and the path, right? So that's one option that you can take. But the other option, if your application needs a lot more interactivity, which this application currently doesn't really support because you can't really get interactivity with Markdown, you can go the traditional approach and put all of your individual files here inside of this app router folder and then render one individual route per file and do all of your custom logic inside of that file. There's no right or wrong way to do it, and each way is for a specific use case, right? So it ultimately all depends on you and what you want to do for your own project, and more importantly, what makes sense for the project. So this is a great example that this way can be done, and the also way can also be done, right? So don't take this as this is the absolute truth and that you have to absolutely do it this way, but rather take it as an inspiration and see that this is a different option to do exactly the same thing. Next up, let's come here and look at a different folder, and let's look at the components folder because, as I said, this also has some very interesting things. Now, first of all, because this project is a bigger project, obviously you have a lot more components. And because of this, they've opted to organize components inside of the components folder in subfolders, which I totally understand. So first you have here common, which is your typical UI components. So things like buttons, things like badges, avatars, search, select tabs, and so on. These are basically really small individual components that usually only do one thing and only render some primitive UI. Like this button component here, it has a couple of props that you can use to configure it, and then it just renders a link and it gives it a role of a button. Then this project also has a different folder, which is, let's close the common folder, is the containers folder. Now this is a different type of component, and these are a little bit bigger components that might have other functionality and definitely use other components. So the containers here in this case are the footer, the navbar, the sidebar. Let's open up the navbar, for example. We can open it here, and we can see that this has a bunch of code to render the actual navbar in this project. The navbar is this top bar over here. That is the code that you're seeing running right here. And as you can see, this component is using the link. It has a nav here, it has a div, it has a bunch of styles, and it's using subcomponents. It's using the nav item over here, right? You have nav items because it shouldn't be the responsibility of the nav bar to render each individual item, but rather use the nav item component, right? Which is here, which is a smaller component that just renders one single item. This is a great example of the single responsibility principle in React applications, where you delegate the actual rendering of other things to other components. So this component navbar handles everything related to the actual navbar, even has a piece of state here for the menu if it's open or not. And then to actually render each individual item, it just maps over it and then delegates the rendering to the nav item component. The nav item component has only one responsibility, which is to actually receive an item and just render it. And it might use some components to actually do that, like this active link component, which, let's see where it comes from, is another custom component. We can open this component here, and this again has one responsibility, which is to render an actual link and handle the active functionality. Active means if you're on the current path over here, it's going to select it and show you, highlight it to know that, hey, you are on the about page, right? Same for learn, same for download. That is the active link in action. Again, right, all of this is a great example of a project at scale, because now you're free to go in and actually use any of the components. And if you have to make a change to some components, you don't have to come here to the main navbar component and make your changes, which is a little bit more intimidating just because there is much more code. You can instead come here to nav item or even to active link and just make the change here and not worry about potentially breaking something in the navbar component when you only want it to work on the active link component, right? This is a great example of a project at scale, which is usually a React application that is made up of multiple small individual components that usually only do one thing. And then here in the root of the components folder, if you can just close the common and containers here, they have something interesting that I haven't really seen in a lot of projects, just because a lot of smaller projects usually don't need to have things like this. But you have all of these with components. These are higher order components, which essentially only take one component and wrap it and add some functionality to it. For example, we have this with current OS component, which only does one thing. Again, it follows the single responsibility principle. This component just receives another component as props through children, and then gets the OS data from useDetectOS, and then just passes it as a prop to that individual component that it's rendering as a child. That's it. And the thing is, it doesn't even have the logic to actually get the operating system data. That logic is put in this custom hook, which is useDetectOS, which is in the hooks folder, right? This is a hook that has some piece of state here, and then it just has the logic for getting the actual user's operating system, and then it just returns it, right? So again, this hook follows the single responsibility principle because it's only doing one thing. And then it's being used inside of this component, which again only does one thing. It just gets the data and then passes it to this component. This is great because anywhere that you want to have the OS data in a component, you can just wrap it with this component and you have it without having to do anything else. And here you have a bunch of these, right? You have with footer, you have with layout, you have with navbar. These are super simple components that are under 50 lines of code. And in some cases, they're even smaller, like with footer is 7 lines of code. All this does is it just renders a footer component. That's it, right? And at first it might seem overkill to do this in a project, right? Why would you create something just for this amount of code? But I can tell you that at scale, when you have a lot of projects, a lot of files, a lot of different developers working on the project, this comes in handy because it's going to save you a lot of time. Because the alternative to doing this, for example, if you want to have a footer here, is you would actually put the footer in the actual component where you need to. So let's say you had a component and you wanted to put a footer. You would add the footer in there. But let's say that now you do that for 5 components. And then somewhere down the line, you want to change how you've added that footer to those 5 components. You would have to go individually to each of those components and actually make the same changes. And chances are you might forget one component because it's impossible to keep track of everything that you have to change. Whereas if you do it this way, then you have one component that you just use everywhere where you want to have a footer. And if you ever need to make a change to how you actually add this footer, you do it in this one component, and then every single place that you've used the footer actually gets those changes and you don't have to worry about them. And more importantly, you never run the risk of forgetting something because you've wrapped every component with this with footer component and you're safe. You're good to go. Right, so again, there is a clear pattern that we're seeing here, which is that if you want to have a project that scales, if you want to have a project that's big, that has a lot of files and a lot of developers working on them, you have to split things up into multiple individual small pieces and reuse those pieces across the entire application. Even if it might seem like overkill, even if it's literally just to do this, right? Just one line of code, it's still worth it to make a separate file, because adopting this pattern across your entire project is the only way that you can actually build something that scales and that scales efficiently. And by the way, in Project React, which is my React course, this is exactly what I teach you. I actually teach you how to do this in a real project, but more importantly, I guide you every step of the way and I actually teach you why. Because looking at this project here, looking at this Node.js website is great and there is a ton to learn and I highly recommend it, but this is only showing you what to do. In Project React, I'm actually showing you and teaching you why to do what we do. Because it's one thing to just see this and be like, oh, this is how they did it. And okay, I get it. It makes sense. And you can actually read and understand it. But it's another thing to understand why they do it this way and the actual benefits of doing it this way versus not doing it this way and what that might cost you in a project that, once again, you want to have it scale and actually be used by multiple developers. And I really believe that this is important. I believe that it's important to understand what to do, but also equally to also understand why to do it, right? So this is exactly what I teach in Project React. And we actually end up building a project that looks very similar to this, except for the fact that you are literally guided every step of the way. So once again, if you're interested, it'll be the first link in the description. Now, here's another underrated folder. Let me close the components folder and let me close the pages folder, and let's go here into the types folder. Now, obviously, this folder is only going to make sense if you're using TypeScript, but even if you're not, there's a lot here about the general mindset of creating a folder like this that you can apply even in a JavaScript project. So this types folder obviously is a folder for every single type that is shared across the application. For example, here we have block, right? This is a file that has a bunch of types, not many, a couple of types over here that are used for blocks across the application, because the application has support for blocks and it makes sense to put all of the types of a block in a specific file in a specific folder. If you look here, every single type here has its own file. You have layout, you have GitHub, you have features, you have OG, navigation, release, search, and so on, right? And doing it this way, once again, is a great way to have scale in your application. Because now, every time that you have a type in your application that you need to use in one component or multiple components, all you have to do is import it from this types folder and everything stays in one place. And also, if you need to create a new type to use in a new component, you would come here and create it because it makes logical sense. There is a clear pattern defined in this project, and you never have to spend time wondering where you should actually put this new type file when there's a types folder specifically for those types of files, right? This is in contrast to actually taking all of this, and let's say, for example, you had a block component and you would define all of your types inside of that file, inside of that block component file. And then even worse, if you had to reuse those types across another file, you would then import those types from the main block component file. And then these types here would be stuck inside of the block component. And if ever in the future you need to have something that has nothing related to a block, but just maybe needs to use the types of a block, you might import it from there, and then this would quickly become a very big mess. And if you then do that across the entire project, across your entire types, then you're going to have a project that doesn't scale, that is very messy, and that is very difficult to work on. So compare this to this, where everything is super clear, everything has a file. Once again, you need a type, go here, import it. You want to create a new type, go here, create the file, and then import it wherever you need it. Doing this is a great design pattern to follow. And again, this is one of the main reasons why this project is so successful and why so many developers can work on it super efficiently. And finally, let's look at my favorite folder in any React project. Again, I will die on this hill. You have the utils folder or util, doesn't really matter how you actually spell it, but this is a folder for small utility functions or helpers or anything that is small but reused and shareable across the entire application. For example, we have detect.os, which is similar to what we've seen before, right? You have this function here that is exported that is detect.os in user agent. It just receives a user agent and then it returns the actual operating system based on that user agent. It's super simple. And if you look here, if you go and copy this and then search for it, we can search and see where it's used. It is used in this file right here, in this over here. You're importing detect.os in user agent, and then it's used for actual tests. So it's not even used in the actual code of the project, but just in tests to be able to use and check that it does exactly what it's supposed to do. Now, I'm not sure why they created this function and only used it in a test, because if you're not using it in the code, what's the point of actually testing this function? Maybe it was used before, I don't know, but the concept still remains, right? If we look at a different file, for example, let's see here, we have date utils. This is a file that has a couple of functions, in this case just one function, which is a function, a utility for handling dates. Date is between. You take a start date, you take an end date, and then it basically returns a boolean if the date is between these two dates. That's it. And again, let's check if this one is used somewhere else in the application, and it is. You have with batch over here. There you go, right? You have this with batch component, which is in components, and then the root of components, that is a higher order component. And all that it does is it checks date is between, and then batch, and then if so, returns a batch and the batch text, and that's it. Again, great component, follows the single responsibility principle, and it uses something that is put in the utils folder. And I think we used it in different places. Yes, with banner, right? We're using date in between here. This is a great example of putting something in a utils folder. It's a small utility function that you can use across different components, and it doesn't have any other logical place to go besides the utils folder, so that's where you put it. I really hope that by now you've realized that the only way to build a really scalable project with React is to do it this way, is to make it composed of multiple small components, each well organized, each clearly defined in a logical place, and then using that strategy to build your application. If you don't do it this way, if you have a bunch of big files with a lot of components and they're all doing so many different things in the same file and in the same component, then it's going to make it really difficult to scale. Any engineer that is going to come in your project and is going to try to contribute is going to have a lot of questions, and they're going to have a hard time actually figuring out what's the best pattern to do what they're trying to do. Whereas with this project, right, I'm pretty confident that if I told you now to actually go and contribute to it, you would be able to make some contributions, even if they're small, just because everything is organized and you would know where to do it, right? If I told you to create a new component, you would go in the components folder and put it here. If I told you to create a new type, or you needed a new type for the components folder, you would actually go in the types folder and put it here. If you had to build a new page, you would go into pages and add the markdown here. It's simple, it's logical, and it's easy to work with. So all in all, this is a great project, and I would highly recommend that you check it out. The code is open source. It's free for you to look at, clone it on your machine, run it. It's super easy to run. It takes literally 2 commands, and play around with it and actually go and try to find the definition of these things and try to trace where things are being used, because again, this is a very valuable resource, and this is the best example of a modern React application that is at scale that you can use and learn from. So again, the link will be in the description. Check it out and actually learn from it, because I highly recommend it. And if you actually want to learn how to build a project to get it to this point and actually understand the why, not just the what, check out Project React, which once again is my React course, which will literally teach you everything that you need to know to build a project just like this one in a very simple and easy to understand way. And you're also going to be guided every step of the way. I've literally put my heart and soul into this course. There's so much content over here, and the students that I've taken it so far have been loving it, and it's entirely changed their way that they view React, and it's made them able to easily build projects like the one that we've just seen. So if you're interested, I would highly recommend it. It'll be the first link in the description. Check it out. There is no other course like it. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos just like this one, make sure to leave this video a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe, or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. And with that being said, my name has been Darius Kozin. This is Kozin Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.